Chapter 14, Part 3. In this video, we'll be looking at the humanistic perspective on personality and personality development, most specifically at George Kelly's personal construct theory and Carl Rogers' self theory. Then we'll be looking at some of the research on self and then, of course, evaluating humanistic theories. The humanistic approaches were very much a reaction to Freud, right? Whereas Freud emphasized internal drives and just the chaos of energy that was going on inside, driving personality. Humanistic approaches emphasize the role of conscious, creative humans with potential and strive towards self-actualization. They held a very positive view of humans and their inherent dignity and goodness of the human spirit. And again, they emphasize the central role of the conscious experience, not the unconscious that Freud had done previously. Motivations for behavior from the humanistic perspective. The drive is an innate tendency towards self-actualization. Now, you may remember self-actualization. You should remember self-actualization from Chapter 11 when we looked at Maslow. Self-actualization is the total realization of one's human potential. The individual's creative potential, it's inborn. It's an innate drive that we have, and it's always striving to be better, to reach the highest expression of our human nature. So the first theory, the first humanistic theory that we're going to talk about is George Kelly's personal construct theory. Kelly's primary interest was researching how people construct reality. Right? So he asserted that humans' primary goal is how you make sense out of the world and find personal meaning to it. Okay? So personal constructs are cognitive categories which sort the people and events in our lives, and we start doing this right at birth. We sort people, we sort experiences, we sort everything into personal constructs, and the personal construct system is the primary basis for individual differences in personality. So each person has their own pattern of preferred constructs. Two people can see the exact same event and categorize the event and the people entirely different. In the text, they give the example of two people who break up, right? So there's 5 people watching for some reason. And anyways, one observer understand that they broke up simply because they were incompatible, right? Whereas another person might describe the situation as the one person was jilted by the other. Another person might interpret the situation as the breakup was a result of parental meddling. And then another person may just see the breakup as a blessing in disguise. So the exact same situation, how we perceive or categorize, how we perceive that situation depends on our personal construct of the events. Personal constructs theory, next step would be, it's not in evaluating what somebody's perception is of the situation or their construct of the situation. It's what does that construction, what are the consequences of having that? So if you were to see the breakup and you see it, one person got jilted by the other, and that's your perception. If that perception leads to feelings of worthlessness or sadness, again, in the text they use the example, if you feel, because you have that construction, because you have that perception, you come to the conclusion that no one is ever going to love me, I'll never be loved again. That is the focus of Kelly's work. So The idea then would be to try to help that person find healthier constructs, healthier perceptions of situations, um, to alleviate the consequence of feeling worthless. So, for example, if you have the perception that you were dumped, right? Somebody broke up with you, and they dumped you because you're a negative person, you're a bad person, you're always complaining. No one's ever going to love me. That's one construct, which has a very, very negative consequence for you personally, right? With how you feel about yourself. So the idea would be to change the perception. They didn't dump me. They broke up with me because we just weren't that compatible, right? I'm not a bad person. Just we had different interests. We wanted to do different things. And that's a much more positive perspective to take on the situation. The next theory we're going to look at is Carl Rogers' self theory. So Carl Rogers was one of the most influential humanistic theorists. So again, in contrast to Freud, Rogers believed that our behavior is not a reaction to unconscious conflicts, but it is a response to our immediate environment, our immediate conscious experience of self and the environment. The forces that direct our behavior, they're a driving force within us, which are driving towards self-actualization. One of the central concepts of self theory is the self, which is also known as self-concept, which you would have heard of. Self-concept is what we think about ourselves, our beliefs about ourselves. Once established, the tendency is to maintain it. It tends to develop in reaction to life experiences, also the culture in which in which you grow up. And the self plays a very powerful role in directing our behavior. So when we're very, very young, we don't see the difference between ourselves. We don't see ourselves as separate from the world. And as our experience with the world and in different situations occurs, then we start to see the difference between me and not me. Right? Then we start to have beliefs about who we are as a person, what makes us different from everything. And that self-concept, it continues to develop across our lifespans, and that self-concept, it helps to understand ourselves in relation to the world. We have a need for self-consistency, which is consistency among self-perceptions, and congruence, consistency between self-perceptions and experience. So what do we mean by that? Self-consistency means there's consistency among our self-perception. So if you find yourself, or if you believe yourself to be charming, attractive, talented, fun, all of those are consistent, right? And then congruence is consistency between self-perceptions and experience. So if you believe yourself to be charming, attractive, fun, and everybody wants to hang out with me, and also people treat you that way, that's consistent, right? But what happens when the experience does not match, right? Threat arises when the experience is inconsistent with self-concept. So if you believe you to be those things and then somebody treats you as though you are not charming, you are not fun, or you are not attractive, that's inconsistent. So your self-perception and your experience now is not congruent, okay? And that causes stress, it causes anxiety. So that does happen in life, right? Where your self-concept and your experience don't match. So the important part is, what do you do in that situation? So healthy individuals will modify the self-concept and think, okay, I can be charming and attractive and fun and charismatic and everybody wants to hang out with me, but Maybe not everybody. Not all people find me that. So that's a healthy adjustment to your thinking, right? Or you can distort reality and just that, and it, results in problems in living, is what they say in the text. Um, so an unhealthy distortion of reality would be they're just not clever enough to see that I'm good. Obviously, they're stupid. Obviously, some other distorted reason why that person is just not attracted to you or does not find you fun. Rogers defines psychological adjustment in terms of the degree of congruence between self-concept and experience. Maladjustment, in A, occurs when a person is faced with incongruities between the self and experience and distorts or denies that reality to make it consistent with the self concept. So they're the person that says, well, obviously they don't find me charming and fun because they're stupid or some other reason why it's their fault. In contrast, extremely well-adjusted people, which will be in B, or fully functioning people, integrate experiences into the self with minimal distortion. So they're able to profit fully from their experiences. So instead of distorting reality, they integrate that into their self, and that is the more healthy way to experience the situation. Another important concept in Carl Rogers' self theory is self-esteem. Self-esteem is how positively or negatively we feel about ourselves. Okay? Self-concept is how we think about ourselves. Self-esteem is how we feel about ourselves. It's our effective evaluation of ourselves. People who have high self-esteem, research done on that has shown that they tend to have fewer interpersonal problems, they're more capable of forming loving relationships, and they tend to achieve at a higher level. People with poor self-esteem, more often associated with anxiety, depression, poor social relationships, and underachievement. Research on self-esteem has found that whether somebody has high self-esteem or low self-esteem, it affects how people act to regulate their mood, and also how expressive one is in terms of social risk, say. So for as far as regulating mood goes, in a situation where somebody experiences failure, people with low self-esteem were less likely to express a desire to improve their mood. And were in a similar situation where a person with high self-esteem experienced failure, they made more intentional acts to increase their own mood. Another area where self-esteem has impact on is how expressive someone is. So in social relationships, how you express yourself, the level of expression, the level of what you share emotionally with someone else, it puts you at a bit of social risk, right? It leaves you a little bit vulnerable when you're telling someone else how you feel, or crying in front of them, or showing any expression, right? So people with low self-esteem tend to be less expressive than those with high self-esteem. They don't want to leave themselves vulnerable. Whereas people with high self-esteem, they're more willing to accept social risk. So they're more willing to share feelings and share other expressions. Research has been done on how do you foster self-esteem? How do you foster like a healthy level of self-esteem? And there's 4 clear ways to do that. One is unconditional acceptance and love from parents, clear guidelines for behavior, reinforcement for compliance, and then lastly, freedom to make decisions and express opinions without guidelines. One example given in the text is a study where there's a group of children with very, very low self-esteem. and they were put into a program, a youth sports program with highly supportive coaches who gave them positive reinforcement and encouragements for their behavior in the program. And what they found is that over the course of time, children's self-esteem increased significantly across the season, and they attributed that that change in their self-esteem to the positive feedback given by the coaches, which caused children to revise their self-concepts in a positive direction. Other research has also found in the 7 steps, the 7 major pillars of positive youth development, is access to a caring adult, to give positive, caring direction to a youth. That's one of the pillars in promoting positive youth development and increasing self-esteem. So one of the most widely used self-esteem scales is from Rosenberg, 1979. I put this in here for you to see the types of questions that are used to measure self-esteem to give you a better idea. So this is on a Likert scale. 1 is strongly agree, 2 is agree, 3 is disagree, and 4 is strongly disagree. And then you answer the 10 questions, and then there would be a measuring, a tool to measure the level of self-esteem. So for example, on the whole, I'm satisfied with myself. At times, I think I am no good at all. This one is obviously reverse scored. I feel that I have a number of good qualities. I am able to do things as well as most people. I feel I do not have much to be proud of, reverse scored. I certainly feel useless at times. I feel that I'm a person of worth. I wish I could have more respect for myself. All in all, I'm inclined to think I'm a failure, reverse scored. I take a positive attitude towards myself. So you'll see that all of those are measure how someone feels about themselves, their effective evaluation of self. Okay, continuing on with Carl Rogers' self-theory. The final concept that we're looking at is Carl Rogers' need for positive regard. This is in line with everything we've been talking about with his theory, the innate need for acceptance, sympathy, love. Carl Rogers believed that, yes, the need for belongingness, the need to be loved, the need to be accepted is an innate human need, and it is essential for healthy development. Gets into talking about unconditional positive regard, which positive regard, independent of the behavior, we're inherently worthy of love, and differentiates that from conditional positive regard, which means that our conditions of worth are dependent upon our behavior. So Carl Rogers believed that conditional positive regard can cause major incongruencies between the self and your experience. It can be very, very harmful in that it teaches children that they're only worthy of approval and love when they meet certain standards or behave in a certain way. For example, a child who has experienced parental approval when behaving in friendly, when they're very, very friendly, they get approval. But when they become angry or upset, then they get the disapproval from their parents. And the result of that can be that they may start to disapprove of their own angry feelings, and then they may start to deny these feelings of anger or being upset because they are judged to be bad behaviors. And then they don't process those emotions in a positive, healthy way. So again, we have a need for positive self-regard. We have a desire and a need to have the experience of being understood. And having this feeling of being understood and value, it gives us freedom to grow. Rogers' work on the self stimulated a lot of interest and research around the area of self-concept. Two important topics at the forefront of research has been development of self-esteem and the roles played by self-enhancement and self-consistency motives, which we're going to look at next. Self-verification and self-enhancement motives. Self-verification, Roger stated that we're motivated to confirm our self-concept. We have a need for self-verification of the concept. Of our self-concepts. One example of this given in the textbook was a study where university students, they met with a participant who gave them feedback about themselves in the form of adjectives that were either consistent or inconsistent with their self-concept. So they described the participant a long list of adjectives. And then later, it doesn't say how much longer later, but a little bit later, the same students were asked to describe how the participant described them. What adjectives did they use to describe them? And the university students had greater recall for adjectives that were consistent. So they remembered all of the adjectives that were consistent with how they thought of themselves. Adjectives that were used to describe them that were not consistent with their self-concept were recalled significantly less. Right? So that's an example how you seek out self-confirming descriptions of yourself, things that are consistent with how you feel about, how you think about yourself. And we also tend to do that with relationships. So people tend to seek out relationships with people who confirm, have similar self-concepts and that confirm our own. Self-enhancement. So Roger says that people have a strong need to regard themselves positively, to have a positive self-image about themselves. So we seek out ways of doing that. So for example, when people are successful at something, they tend to attribute that to their own abilities and their own skills. Whereas when we fail at something, we tend to attribute it to something outside of our control. Other examples included in the text states that the vast majority of business people and politicians, they rate themselves as more ethical than average, right? And then another example is people who have been in the hospital after causing auto accidents. They rate themselves as more skillful than the average driver. So basically, people tend to have very positive illusions about themselves. Another example they gave is that 80% of high school students rate themselves in the top 10% in their ability to get along with others. Now, that is mathematically impossible, but people having this positive illusion of themselves contributes to our psychological well-being. So blown out of control, but actually good for you. So how does self-concept and the self possibly differ across culture or across gender? A study that they did, they had Americans and Japanese, and they asked the question stem, I am blank. Okay, so the participants were given that question and they could fill it in however they liked. Some of the answers were things like I am honest, I am smart, I am this, or they could say things like I'm the oldest son, I'm a student, I'm a sister, I'm a mother. Okay. So the researchers classified these statements into two different categories. One of them is personal attributes, which is about me. I am honest, I am smart, and that is this column here, right? Then the other answers could be a social identity, social relational. For example, if you were to answer the questions, I am the oldest son, I am a sister, I am a mother, I am a student. So what is your social identity? And what they found is Americans were far more likely than Japanese to list personal attributes, abilities, or dispositions, where Japanese will more frequently describe themselves in terms of their social identity, which goes back to culture, excuse me, and Western countries tending to be more individualistic, and Asian countries tending, or Eastern countries tending to be more collectivistics, where they view achievement, everything in terms of group goals. Another difference is in terms of gender and how that shapes self-concept and what we feel as is important, things that we strive to be. And within different cultures, this tends to be different, right? So within a given culture, say gender schemas tell us what the typical man or woman should be like. What does the culture deem as the ideal? In Western cultures, it tends to be that the ideal male qualities that are held in high regard, qualities such as achievement, strength, self-sufficiency, tends to be more of an individualistic, right, attitude, whereas females, the ideal attributes tend to be more in terms of helpfulness, kindness, self-competencies, which reflect more of a collectivist ideal, right? And of course, they're careful to say that it's not black and white like that, but that just tends to be how Western culture positions the ideal gender schema. Evaluating humanistic theories. The biggest criticism of humanistic theories is that the research into concepts and into the theories themselves relies too much on personal self-reports. Personal self-reports or reflections from participants, not really considered scientific. Another one is the vagueness, how to define self-actualization tendency. These concepts are a little bit vague, so they're difficult to measure. Humanistic theories and approaches are actually, what they have done, very positive thing, is major contributions to psychotherapy approaches, with the idea of looking at the perceived self versus the ideal self, how you categorize or perceive certain situations, and then looking at the consequences for how you perceive them, and then intentionally going about changing your perspectives on things in order to process them in a more positive way. Research on psychotherapy and looking at the difference between, like at the beginning of psychotherapy, and the client's ideal selves of how they would like to be, and then closer to the end of therapy, right? Their perceived selves at the end revealed that when clients first entered therapy, the discrepancy was very, very large. But in doing humanistic therapy techniques to do with the self, the difference got smaller and smaller. So their ideal self and their perceived self became more aligned across the therapy sessions. Overall, looking at the three theories, George Kelly's theory emphasizes the subjective experience of the individual and how we make sense out of the world and find a meaning with it. Carl Rogers' theory attaches importance to the role of self and how sometimes there's incongruencies between our self-concept that we have and then what our experiences in the real world. And then Rogers' theory helped to stimulate a great deal of research on self-concept, self-esteem, self-enhancement, self-verification, and how these all interact within cultural and gender boundaries. That is the end of part 3, humanistic perspectives on personality.